Welcome to Hamburgers and Horror, the home of meat, monsters, and melty face. I'm Noah Hook, and today we're looking at The Burning. This classic 1981 slasher follows a camp caretaker named Cropsey who is horribly burned when a prank goes wrong. After years of immense pain, he is released from the hospital and he sets his vengeful sights on a new group of teenage campers. I was honestly expecting The Burning to have a quick and easy background to discuss, but holy shit, this movie has some interesting history. You can skip ahead to this time if you just want to hear the breakdown, but I think some of this is worth learning about. The legend of Cropsey is a real thing that actually spans back to the 70s, where it became a popular campfire tale in Staten Island. It was the typical kind, an escaped mental patient who carried a bloody axe or had a hook for a hand, but what made Cropsey specific was his affiliation with the Willowbrook mental hospital. Willowbrook was a housing system and hospital in Staten Island for children with physical and mental disabilities that ran from 1947 to 1987, and it is infamous for its awful conditions and abuse of its patients. It had a big influence on the hospital and sisters after a disturbing expose was done on Willowbrook earlier in 1972. The legend of Cropsey usually describes him as an escaped patient from the hospital, but the truth is actually scarier. I was sad to learn these stories were tied to real-life events, as a child kidnapper and suspected serial killer named Andre Rand was active in Staten Island from as early as 1972. He actually worked at Willowbrook in the 60s, and he buried one of his victims outside of the abandoned school in 1987. I couldn't figure out how Staten Islanders landed on the nickname Cropsey, but it goes to show you your favorite movies might have some weird origins. If you're interested in learning more about the Cropsey legend, you should also check out 1982's Madman, another slasher based on the urban legend, although a lot of the Cropsey related stuff was changed to avoid confusion with The Burning. There was also a great documentary called Cropsey from 2008, which focuses on the crime spree of Andre Rand as well as the effects he had on the Staten Island community. But it was this legend that inspired Harvey Weinstein during his pursuit of breaking into the film industry. He wrote a script called The Cropsey Maniac and registered it in 1979, which he collaborated on with screenwriter Tony Maylam and producer Brad Gray. Maylam, who has brought us films like The Riddle of the Sands, Split Second, and Journal of a Contract Killer, was also brought on as the director. The final screenplay was completed by Bob Weinstein, as well as Peter Lawrence of Silverhawks and Thundercats. They made sure to conform their script to the still developing rules of the genre, including lots of kills, lots of nudity, and a very distinct looking killer. While the script was written before Friday the 13th actually came out, it's clear the success of that film had a bit of influence on The Burning. The Weinsteins actually formed Miramax during the film's production, and this was a lot of important people's first foray into the movie-making industry. Y'all know I won't sit here and pretend the Weinsteins aren't horrible men, but I also can't pretend they didn't have a profound effect on the horror genre moving forward. But a lot of those important starts I mentioned include the huge ensemble cast, which includes Jason Alexander from Seinfeld, Brian Matthews from The Young and the Restless, Leah Ayres from Bloodsport, Brian Backer from Fast Times, Fisher Stevens from Short Circuit, Holly Hunter from The Piano, Larry Joshua from Dances with Wolves, and Ned Eisenberg from Law & Order Special Victims Unit. Cropsey himself is played by Lou David from Comeback Charleston Blue and The Last Dragon, although Tony Maylam claims he played the character most of the time. Filming took place on real summer camps to keep costs low, with the cinematography being handled by Harvey Harrison of American Gothic. The film was edited by Jack Shoulder, who would go on to direct Alone in the Dark and A Nightmare on Elm Street 2. And the score was composed by progressive rock star Richard Wakeman. The Weinsteins also secured the special effects work of Tom Savini, who at this point had already worked on Dawn of the Dead, Maniac, and Friday the 13th. As usual, he was very hands-on during the production, and apparently the kids were really excited to learn the different ways they were going to be killed. The Burning had a very vague budget of somewhere between $500,000 and $1.5 million, but either way, it didn't fare well at theaters. Aside from having a pretty small release, it also had to compete with other slashers like My Bloody Valentine, The Funhouse, Happy Birthday to Me, Final Exam, Graduation Day, Eyes of the Strangler, a release of the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, and of course Friday the 13th Part 2. 1981 was the middle of the golden age for slashers and just a great year for horror in general, so The Burning just had too much competition to make it stand out to audiences. It only grossed around $700,000 in the US, but it did well enough overseas to make back its budget and some. Another reason for its soft numbers was due to censorship, with the MPAA absolutely butchering slasher movies during this time. An uncut version of this film apparently wasn't available until its DVD release in 2007. Most critics weren't impressed at the time, citing its similarities to Friday the 13th and other recent slashers. It has only gained adoration through the years though, with newfound appreciation for its soon-to-be all-star cast, its great practical effects, and a villain that is usually included in the best of slashers. The Burning currently has a respectable 73 and 60% on Rotten Tomatoes, and it's generally regarded as one of the better Golden Age slashers. I've seen The Burning a few times now, and I would agree with that sentiment. It is a pretty derivative plot, but it has enough unique stuff going on to make it stand out. But with all of that said, it's probably time we hop over to Camp Stonewater and see for ourselves. I hope your hedges need trimming, cause we're watching The Burning. The movie opens at Camp Blackfoot, where a group of boys are planning to seek revenge on the mean caretaker, Cropsy. They carry matches and a mystery box over to Cropsy's cabin, and the lead boy brings it inside. He sets the box right next to the sleeping caretaker and removes the mystery item, and once he's out, they start howling like wolves and banging on his window. Cropsy awakens to find a rotting, candle-eyed skull, and in his panic he knocks it onto his very flammable bed. The fire turns into an inferno when it reaches his poorly placed kerosene for his lanterns, and Cropsy emerges completely engulfed in flames. The kids flee as he tumbles down a hill into a stream, and we jump forward a week at Cropsy's hospital. A pessimistic nurse decides to show a new doctor the burn victim to scare him, but before he can, he is grabbed by Cropsy's burnt-ass arm. We don't get to see his burnt-ass face yet, but at least we get a title card. The opening credits take us 5 years later, and we learn that Cropsy is being kicked out of the hospital. Several attempts at skin grafting has failed, and the staff tell Cropsy not to hold resentment for the campers that did this to him. Yeah, that sounds really likely. So now Cropsy is just vibing in Staten Island, where he picks up a prostitute. Despite the fact he is silent and covers his face, she invites him into her home, and Cropsy opts to do it with the lights off. Unfortunately, it isn't pitch black, and the terrified woman tells him to leave. This angers Cropsy, and he starts strangling her, and when she reaches for some scissors, he stabs her in the torso with them. I don't think he quite pushes her out the window, but he completes the kill off screen. Now we hop over to Camp Stonewater, where we meet a very large group of characters playing softball. We've got Counselor Michelle, Blonde Girl Sally, Brunette Girl Karen, Weird Boy Alfred, Funny Boy Dave, and Pervy Boy Eddie. And when I say pervy, I mean he harasses Karen consistently throughout the movie. He convinces her to meet him later that night, and a girl named Tiger chases a ball into the nearby woods. Cropsy's here with some shiny new shears, but before he can cut down any brush to help her search for the ball, she finds it and returns to the game. At the cafeteria, Michelle gives Karen some dating advice, which is pretty much to steer clear of creepy-ass Eddie, but I don't think that's gonna happen. The next morning, Sally goes to take a shower, and boob shots don't get much more gratuitous than this, folks. She hears the floor creaking outside her stall, and Michelle comes running when she hears a scream. She bumps into the fleeing Alfred on her way in, and Sally confirms he was watching her as he is caught by Eddie and Counselor Todd. Michelle is rightfully furious, but Todd, who is dating Michelle, believes Alfred just needs some firm guidance. She calls him a pushover and wants Alfred kicked out, but Todd promises her that if Alfred continues being a problem, he will send him home. He asks Alfred why he was prowling around the showers, pointing out that Sally's boyfriend Glazer is gonna be pissed. Alfred says that everyone is always picking on him and he hates it at camp. and Todd shares they are more alike than he thinks. He was sent home from camp 5 years ago for something he did, if you catch my drift, and he offers to lend an ear anytime Alfred needs to talk about something. Meanwhile, the girls try cheering up Sally by reminding her of the 3-day canoe trip coming up, but they all take a turn making fun of Glazer as well. If you're wondering why, it's because Glazer is a big meathead bully. He tells Alfred to stay away from Sally or he'll beat the crap out of him, which in this particular instance seems reasonable to me, but Todd overhears and intervenes. This 30-year-old tells the other 30-year-old that bullying is bad, and he promises Glazer if he catches even a whiff of bullying again, he will be sent home. Dave and his buddies Fish and Woodstock want to teach Alfred how to swim in preparation for the trip, but Glazer runs up and pushes him into the lake. So much for no more bullying. The boys help bring him back ashore, and Glazer tries and fails to publicly flirt with Sally. Woodstock pulls a pellet gun out of his ass, and on Dave's command, he shoots him in the ass. Glazer screams as the boys moon him, and this queen pushes him back into the water. That night, Dave returns from town with contraband goods like Playboys, Hustlers, and condoms. But apparently Glazer only uses lubricated condoms. Sounds like you're not doing your job, hoss. The masculine antics come to a halt when Alfred sees Cropsey look into their cabin, but he's long gone when the others take a look. Todd herds the hooligans to dinner, and Glazer continues his douchebaggery by harassing Sally, assaulting Dave, and threatening Alfred. Woodstock apparently needs his vitamin E supplement, which really upsets Fish.
Alright, which one of you guys got my vitamin E? Vitamin E? Christ, Woodstock, you don't believe in all that crap. Just don't knock it. You leave my champ alone, huh?
He goes to grab it, and the camp supervisor runs through some expectations for the canoe trip. The cabin light is no longer working, but before Cropsey's POV can come inside, Woodstock is found by Todd. The banjos erupt as the canoe trip begins, and the kids get into a rootin' tootin' splash around. That night, Todd tells the campers about the legend of Cropsey. Apparently, he was an evil drunk who loved scaring the kids, and he'd always carry around his garden shears. He started stalking one of the campers night and day, but the kid and his buddies planned a prank to get back at him. It went wrong and Cropsey burned, but in Todd's version, his body was never found. He still lives in the woods feeding off raw animals, just waiting for some campers to come his way. Eddie jumps out in a knockoff Pazuzu mask for a big group scare, and later that night he goes on a stroll with Karen. He asks her why she is so off and on with him, and she shares her concerns about his high body count. Eddie argues that fucking is fun, so they should do it, and he strips down and invites her to go skinny dipping. Karen reluctantly joins him in the water, but when Eddie starts getting too handsy, she asks him to stop. He gets real mad and sends her away, but looks like Cropsey has made a scavenger hunt out of her clothes. She starts redressing piece by piece, but when she reaches her jacket, Cropsey grabs her and slits her throat. Michelle and Todd realize Karen is missing the next morning, but Eddie angrily says nothing happened between them and he thought she went back to camp. Some kids inform Michelle that the canoes are gone, and she assumes Karen took one to go back to camp, accidentally releasing the others. They gather the kids to make sure this isn't a prank, and they ultimately decide to split up and gather materials to build a raft. Todd expresses his concerns with Michelle, citing how unlikely it would be for the canoes to just vanish, and Glazer continues to harass Sally in the woods. A lot of progress is made on the raft, and Glazer finally wears her down enough to sleep with him later that night. He promises to make it a magical evening. Alfred, what the fuck are you doing? Now the raft is finished, I guess. That was quick. And Eddie, Woodstock, Fish, and 2 girls named Marnie and Diane are sent to retrieve canoes from the camp. No offense, counselors, but sending them on their way like this without a counselor seems pretty irresponsible. It also looks pretty miserable, at least until they spot one of the missing canoes. They paddle their way over to it, but once they are within stabbing distance, Cropsey jumps out of hiding and attacks. He massacres the whole group, with Fish and Marnie getting stabbed, Woodstock losing some fingers, Eddie taking a breather, and Diane getting slashed. Michelle and Todd relish in the great job they're doing and decide to abandon the still living children to get it on. Glazer and Sally are also getting it on, and it's all of 30 uncomfortable seconds before Glazer nuts. She is obviously disappointed, but she actually takes pity on him and offers to stay with him and try again later. Glazer decides to sneak back and take some matches to start a fire, leaving another lone naked girl for Cropsy to Chopsy. Alfred watches as Glazer snags the matches, and because Alfred is a creep, he decides to follow. Glazer returns to Sally thinking she fell asleep, but I think Cropsy climbed into the sleeping bag as well, and he stabs him in the throat. He lifts the bully up and pins him to a tree, and Alfred runs as Cropsy drops him. Alfred wakes up Todd and terribly explains the situation, but he eventually gets it out that a burnt guy killed Glazer. Todd reluctantly agrees to go with him, but who would have guessed the killer is still at the place you just saw him at? Todd gets a flesh wound slash and Cropsy chases Alfred through the forest. He manages to slip away from the killer as Todd regains consciousness, and Michelle and the others are surprised to see the raft floating back downstream. She swims out to see what's going on, and just as Todd returns, she finds a pile of young corpses. The kids are all in varied stages of freaked the fuck out, and Cropsy is still on an Alfred hunt. Todd sends Michelle, Dave, and the other remaining campers back onto the murder raft to get some help, and he sets out to save Alfred. The little voyeur is being watched by the big voyeur, and just like that, Michelle has reached the camp. She tells the supervisor there is a killer in the woods, and they call the police and hop on a motorboat back to the scene. Alfred has found his way to some abandoned structure, but just when he thinks he's safe, Cropsy grabs him and drags him into what Wikipedia calls an old mine shaft. Todd hears his screams and starts running, but instead of immediately killing Alfred, Cropsy gags him and pins him to a wall with his shears. Todd and his axe follow the muffled cries to the mine, where he narrowly avoids an incoming cart and discovers Karen's body. Cropsy found a flamethrower, I guess, and as the killer approaches Todd, he flashes back to 5 years ago. We confirm Todd was one of the boys who mutilated Cropsy, but the killer extinguishes his flame to continue his usual quiet stalking. He waits for Todd to enter the Alfred room to relight the torch, and we finally see his face as he dodges some axe swings. Michelle calls out to the boys as Todd is knocked over, and the killer backs him into a corner. Alfred manages to get free though, and he stabs Cropsy in the back with his own shears. The killer drops to the floor as a police helicopter meets Michelle, but he's not quite done yet. He jumps back up, only for Todd to immediately annihilate his head with an axe. Alfred sets the burn victim ablaze, and the boys head out satisfied with their job well done. We watch Cropsy burn before jumping to another Staten Island campfire, where the Cropsy legend has expanded to include his yearly summer camp killings. And that's The Burning. It's not perfect, but there is a lot of stuff to appreciate here. I'd say it's one of the big three when it comes to summer camp slashers, with the other two being Friday the 13th and Sleepaway Camp, and The Burning honestly holds up just as well as those two big dogs. There is a great contrast between the lighthearted camp scenes and the brutal violence once Cropsy attacks. And that contrast is also highlighted by the score and cinematography to create a pretty dynamic slasher. Those attack sequences, especially the raft scene, also have way more artistry and reservation than one might expect. The gore is only shown very briefly, and more emphasis is put on the victim's terror in their final moments. The practical effects are obviously solid with Tom Savini, although I do have to admit his final look is a little bit underwhelming. But even so, Cropsy is a pretty unique slasher villain. We're led to believe he was an awful dude before the fire, but you can't help but feel a little bit of sympathy for him after the accident. He is a monster in the eyes of everyone around him, so his subsequent rage makes sense. I also appreciate that he was clearly killed by the end. Sometimes a movie doesn't need 8 sequels, and I think The Burning is a good example of that. It definitely has some of those low-budget horror movie issues that we've talked about before though. Literal 30-year-olds are playing kids half their age, the lighting in a few of the night scenes is worse than AVP Requiem, and there are occasional jumps in time that are hard to follow if you're not paying close attention. The acting is surprisingly strong though, and the kids have some of that weird sleepaway camp charm to them. It's also a very horny horror movie, like half the characters are solely motivated by sex. The film is guilty of having some very gratuitous nudity, which is made worse when you remember these are supposed to be teenagers. But I appreciate that there's also male nudity, and they took the time to explore themes around coercion and consensuality. But while a lot of the characters are likable, there are a lot that really suck. Glazer and Eddie are awful, Alfred is a creep despite the film trying to make him sympathetic, and Todd is an apologist for most of their shitty behavior, so I am left with very few male characters to root for. Except for Dave, he's the best part of this movie. I also wish Michelle was given more to do by the end. She was Final Girl material with her confidence, intelligence, and clear morality compared to everybody else. Hell, they could have killed Alfred and Todd and had Michelle finish Cropsy off, and I probably would have enjoyed that more. But I do give the movie props for having not one, but 2 final boys, as that is pretty unique for the time. And overall, The Burning does stand out as an above-average slasher. It doesn't deviate from the genre expectations laid out before it, but those rules were established because they work. There are great buildups of suspense and a few very memorable kills. Comparing it to other slasher movies I've covered on the channel, it's somewhere in between masterpieces like Halloween and Black Christmas, and mid-tier slashers like Prom Night and Silent Night, Deadly Night. It honestly might be in my top 10 favorite slashers, but that's something I would have to sit down and think about. But I would recommend The Burning to any horror fan at least once. It's consistently good and occasionally brilliant. I actually think The Burning could be primed and ready for a great remake, but let me know what you think about that down in the comments. Well, that's about it. How do y'all like The Burning? How does it stand up to other summer camp slashers for you? Let me know down below, and join me in 2 weeks as we check out a Cronenberg classic with Scanners. Thank you all for joining me, and an extra thank you to my patrons. As always, I'm Noah Hook, and thanks for watching Hamburgers and Horror. Stay safe out there. Thanks for watching my review of The Burning. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to like and subscribe so you can keep up with all my horror reviews. And if you want to help support the channel further, you should check out my Patreon account. You'll be able to vote for future movies and franchises I cover on the channel. Thanks y'all.